Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Mark Kimmitt. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. And in Doha is Martin Reardon. He's a Senior Vice President of the Soutan Group, a security consultancy, and a former member of the FBI. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. General Kimmitt, let me begin with you. Do you agree with Colonel Sean Ryan, who says we expect a long and hard fight against Daesh? These are the die-hard fighters with nowhere else to go. Is it going to get ugly?
Well, I don't think it's going to get particularly ugly because to a great extent, Daesh has transformed itself from being a large military organization resident inside of a caliphate into a much smaller groups, large numbers of those groups, but smaller groups that are no longer fighting militarily, but as terrorists again.
General Kimmitt, when we look at it, there are still some estimates that say they still have between 20 to 30,000 fighters. Isn't it then theoretically and practically more difficult to fight between 20 to 30,000 people who are spread disparately rather than the past when they were all sort of in the same place?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It's one, more difficult simply because they're dispersed to so many different locations that are types of intelligence systems that we have, overhead imagery, intelligence collection services, are not as, they don't present as large of a target. Second, they're also fighting differently. They're no longer going to be fighting as squads and platoons, but they're going to be fighting as terrorists, and in fact avoiding fighting and going back to their old practices of using IEDs, suicide bombers, and selected assassinations. So yes, it will be more difficult.
Martin Reardon, for those who look at the situation in Hajin and its surroundings and see it as some sort of final showdown and grand finale, that if Daesh is defeated there, they're gone, they're done and dusted, it's finished, are they prematurely celebrating here? Should we be more cautious?
I think so. I mean, in Hajin, I think it's expected that they'll be defeated there. And once that happens, the caliphate, as far as territory, will no longer exist. But as the general mentioned, ISIS is still a formidable force, a terrorist organization. They're basically changing. They're going from expanding and remaining in place to adapting and evolving. They're changing back into a counterinsurgency, back into a terrorist organization, which is how they started out in 2004. Remember, ISIS isn't new. They go back under a number of different names since 2004. And at one point, they were pushed back underground and weren't really a threat. But they came back with a vengeance in 2011, then again in 2014 when they stormed back into Mosul. So ISIS is very much a threat, a terrorist threat, not only in Iraq and Syria, but in ungoverned space throughout the world, in North Africa, in the Sahel, in East Africa, in Asia. They're active in Asia. And of course, as a terrorist organization, they're very much a threat in Russia, in Europe, potentially in North America, and right, the rest of the world.
Yeah, okay. So in a few moments, I'm going to try and look at some of those hotspots and see how it might differ tactically and otherwise in trying to defeat them there. But let me focus on Iraq and Syria for the moment, General Kimmitt. How did you get it right, I guess? It's been a bunch of years, and sometimes we don't often give credit where it's due when a terribly horrible, horrendous organization is on its knees and on the verge of being defeated. It took a lot of troops, a lot of different countries' armies, a lot of airstrikes, thousands of airstrikes to get to where we are now. What was, I guess, at the core of the strategy that allowed these countries and the coalition to get to this point of nearly being at victory?
Well, I think in many ways it was the mistake that they made, the strategic mistake that ISIS made that caused them to differ with Zawahiri and core al-Qaeda. If you remember, core al-Qaeda said it is not yet time to establish the caliphate. The caliphate is not ready, the ground is not set, the area is not yet fertile for you to establish the caliphate. They said that if you do, it will be destroyed, because when you become a caliphate and you become a military organization and you're fighting the coalition of 60 nations with far better technology, far better capability, and quite frankly, far more experience at fighting semi-conventional wars, it was inevitable that they were going to be defeated as a military organization inside of a caliphate. That's playing to our strength. Zawahiri was smart enough to recognize that. So what are they doing? They're going from ISIS 2.0 back to ISIS 1.0, which has been so successful for them, back to the days of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2003 and 2004.
And that will cook up its own set of challenges. Martin Reardon, was it a mistake? Do you agree with General Kimmitt that they should not have, if you were tactically advising them, they should not have actually established the caliphate and centered themselves in places like Mosul and Raqqa because it made it easier to defeat them?
Yes, I mean, I agree with the general. That split with Zawahiri was a tactical blunder. Keeping in mind, the ideology of Al-Qaeda and the ideology of the Islamic State really don't differ. They want the same three things. They want to diminish the Western influence in Muslim countries. They want to overthrow the corrupt or apostate regimes in those Muslim countries, which, as far as ISIS is concerned, is every government, every Muslim government is corrupt except their own. And then eventually the establishment of a caliphate. And as the general said, Al-Qaeda was taking the long game on this. This is something that will happen, but it could be a few generations down the road. Al-Baghdadi went too fast. He established a caliphate, and basically he had the world going against him. And as the general said, he was in no position to take on a conventional war against NATO, against the United States, against the Arab coalition that went up against him.
And Martin, as we broaden this out,
and the new modern, the new Iraqi military.
Right, of course. And as we broaden this out and we look at the franchises around the world, some of those that you mentioned, in Afghanistan, in the Sahel, and in other places, what worries you the most? The Sinai, even. I mean, we're seeing them, you know, with multiple atrocities in multiple places over the past couple of years, so they're not dead yet. When you look at where they are, what worries you particularly?
The fact that there's really no end in sight. Whether it's the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, any terrorist organization, they thrive in ungoverned space. And that's what you have in these countries that you've mentioned, ungoverned space, where the local population have a lot of grievances, some legitimate, maybe not, others not so legitimate. But as long as they have that governed space, they'll go in and they'll thrive, and they'll continue to recruit young people. Keep in mind, Islamic State, they've got a few things going for them. They've got a war chest that, by some estimates, could exceed $400 million outside of Iraq and Syria. They've got a propaganda machine that is just, it resonates worldwide with people that follow that ideology. And again, there's not going to be a shortage of future foreign fighters or future fighters as long as you have these grievances in certain locales within the world.
Mark Kimmitt, where's the new center of tension? What worries you?
Well, what worries me is not a location, but it's time. Look, these are the same points we were making back in 2003, 2004. 2005, CENTCOM released the study of the Long War, and everything that Martin has said then, we were saying back in 2003, 2004. These organizations find sanctuary and safe haven in ungoverned spaces. This is a generational problem. This is an ideological problem. They are going to find these ungoverned spaces because that's their best area to train and to prosper. And what worries me is that it has been almost 15 years now since we were saying this at CENTCOM, and there has not been any appreciable ability to push back on this. It is like whack-a-mole. If it gets destroyed in Iraq and Syria or diminished in Iraq and Syria, it can go to Mali, it can go to the Sinai, it can go down to Oman, it can go down into Yemen. It has the ability to propagate anywhere around the world, and even though we've been able to stamp it out or significantly mitigate its capabilities in one area, it continues to crop in other areas. So after 15 years, right, we haven't seen the progress.
Right, and talking about, you know, mitigating their capabilities, the US dropped the mother of all bombs on the group purportedly, about a year and a half ago, that hasn't quite stemmed the flow of growth of Daesh in Afghanistan. So with that in mind, is just dropping bombs on them, really the solution?
Well, it certainly isn't, and I think we can't take the dropping of the mother of all bombs as idiomatic of how we're fighting this war. In fact, what has been happening over the last 15 years is a growing capability, particularly among our high-end special operations forces, to reach out, to find them, and to destroy them, but not with bombs, but with good intelligence, primarily good intelligence, and then the use of local forces to either apprehend them or kill them. That's going to be the success going forward. It's not going to be by dropping bombs. It's going to be by good intelligence, good local forces going up against them.
Martin, how agile are they? And are they capable of taking direction from, I don't know, Baghdadi or the center of power, or does that not matter at all? If an attack is going to take place, do they have to get the order from whoever, or can you just do it and afterwards, I don't know, claim your brothers will claim credit?
Well, I think if you look at the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, both, they went from, well, Al-Qaeda from a very centralized organization to a decentralized organization out of necessity in 2002, 2003. They had to, that's when the affiliates for Al-Qaeda came on, and Islamic State initially was an affiliate. It was the biggest affiliate for Al-Qaeda when they were Al-Qaeda in Iraq and a number of other names. So they don't need to have that central direction. And I think what you've seen, a lot of the attacks, there are people who are inspired by the ideology, and they claim either Islamic State or they claim Al-Qaeda. But they're inspired by that ideology. They're not taking direction. You have some of these attacks where there was direction, whether it came from Al-baghdadi or it came from one of the other affiliates in North Africa or elsewhere in the world. But they do get some direction. But they're very capable, as is Al-Qaeda, of operating independently. Individuals or very small, unaligned cells.
Right. And General Kimmett, the Trump administration's approach to this in the Middle East in general over the past couple of years has been ISIS first or Daesh first, even within the fog of the Syrian war, ultimately even the support of the SDF and YPG affiliates connected to the PKK was always about, they're helping us defeat Daesh, that's why we support them, that's why we arm them, and that has ebbed and flowed over the past few months, and it's been an interesting relationship with Turkey, to say the least. Is that still the right approach, having a Daesh-first approach, eliminate them first and then everybody else?
Well, candidly, it's our only authorized approach. Right now, the U.S. Congress has accepted the fact that U.S. forces and the coalition are operating inside of Syria for the specific purpose of defeating Daesh. They have no other authority to either go against the regime or to push back on the Iranian and Russian influence inside of Syria. So as I've said before, this isn't a matter of aspirations, it's a matter of authorizations, and that's all they're authorized to do inside of Syria at this point.
And Martin Reardon, as we mentioned before, it's not necessarily just about the groups themselves. There's not too much difference between, say, Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra and other Al-Qaeda-linked groups. They come from the same fountain of ideology. Is it a mistake to maybe then focus only on Daesh and ignore some other groups that are very similar because they might just grow in strength while you're focusing on Daesh?
Well, that would be a mistake, but I don't think we're focusing only on Daesh or the Islamic State. There is a focus on Al-Qaeda and both of those organizations' affiliates worldwide. But I think we go back to 2014 when the Islamic State came back down into Iraq and stormed Mosul and took over much of that country. Remember, 2014, they were a territory almost the size of the United Kingdom. That was a threat. It was a threat to the government of Iraq. It was a threat throughout that region. So it was the right response. Let's focus heavily on Islamic State now, diminish them as a military force so we can stabilize these governments. And at the same time, look at the other organizations, Al-Qaeda and their affiliates around the world.
Martin, over the past couple of years, as their land, as their territory began to shrink, the conventional wisdom was they're going to be more dangerous, more erratic, more capable of inspiring lone wolf attacks, and maybe they'll lash out in places like Turkey more often. Now, thankfully, it hasn't happened the way a lot of people would have expected it to happen. Turkey has been particularly quiet over the past couple of years vis-a-vis Daesh attacks. Is that because there's just been better preventative measures taken by a country like Turkey, or that these guys just lack the capability and the organizational structures right now?
Well, I think we've seen with their past record, they certainly have the capability, the technical capability to carry out these attacks. It is, as you said, in large part due to law enforcement and intelligence actions, not only in Turkey, but throughout the Middle East, much of the Middle East, in Europe, in particular North America. Quite frankly, intelligence and law enforcement are better at intercepting these plans and thwarting them, breaking into these cells. But they're still a threat. There is, by some estimates, as many as 5,600 foreign fighters that have returned to 36 different countries, from Iraq and Syria. So they're home. Some of them have had enough fighting. They're not going to fight anymore. Other ones are still, they have the ideology. They still want to attack what they consider to be enemies of Islam. They're there. They're underground right now, but it's going to be a long-term fight.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, it's been fascinating talking to both of you, Martin Reardon and Mark Kimmett. Thanks for joining us once again on the Newsmakers.